President Obama calls it the biggest, most important step to combating climate change. His Clean Power Plan demands nationwide limits on carbon dioxide emissions from power plants. But can he defeat the powerful coal lobby before the UN climate conference? And even if he does, is his bill enough to make a difference to global warming? Hello, I'm Taimur Nabili. This is Between the Lines. Now, no sooner had Obama's Clean Power Plan been tabled than the coal lobbyists in the US and the anti-government right-wing politicians vowed to bring it down. Legal action is being prepared to derail the bill's provisions and limit the power of the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, if passed, the president's bill would cut greenhouse gas emissions from US power plants by 32% from 2005 levels. The goal is to encourage states and utilities to invest in renewable energy supplies and reduce reliance on higher polluting sources, principally coal-fired power plants. Now, Obama is keen to claim global leadership ahead of the climate change summit in Paris later this year, but his opponents are just as determined to protect their interests. They argue that the measures will cripple local economies and destroy jobs, while many of the lobby groups still maintain that climate change scientists are just wrong. But is the Obama bill as significant as the president is claiming? And will it make a real difference in the fight against climate change? And as we progress towards the Paris conference, what message does this political row send to other polluting nations? Well, joining me on the program tonight are, from London, Guillaume Perret is founder and director of Perret Associates. He's been involved in the coal market since 2000. Dr. Sharath Rao is in Bangalore. He's a senior research scientist with the Center for Study of Science, Technology and Policy. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Guillaume, let me begin with you, if I might. At the moment, the biggest noise is coming from the coal industry in the United States, who are deeply annoyed by this bill. Can you give us your sense of what it would mean for them?
Sure. Well, we think that, well, first of all, we need to wait and see until the next US elections in the late 2016. We think that until then, not a lot of this new legislation will be implemented, in particular given the opposition you mentioned already that is taking place in the US. But looking at it from a broader perspective, we think that this legislation is just a continuation of what has been going on in the US since 2011, since 2012, meaning an increased scrutiny on CO2 emissions from thermal generators, in particular coal generators. And from that perspective, we can say that it is just probably another nail in the coffin of the coal industry in general in the US. Accentuating potentially the decrease both in coal demand but also in coal production and coal exports from the US, which from our perspective as market analysts can provide some interesting signals.
Yes, I mean, I mentioned that the loudest noise is coming from the coal industry and from the right-wing politicians, but as you point out, a number of the critics also come from the other side of the argument, who say the problem with this is not that it's cutting things too fast, that it's not cutting it enough. I mean, let me quote to you the former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, who says, "We're already halfway to the EPA's goal, 7 years before its rules even take full effect." I mean, what people are saying is that Obama's dressing this up as a major initiative, but actually he's not making that many cuts at all. Do you agree with that?
Okay, I would...
Yeah, we agree with that. I mean, to some extent,
Guillaume, carry on.
The damage has been done to a large extent. We think that the damage has been done to a large extent to the coal industry in the US. Just as an example, the coal production, the domestic coal production last year decreased to around 895 million tons in 2014. This was the lowest level since 1993. For the first time just a few months ago, in April 2015, we saw gas-fired generation exceeding coal-fired generation in the US. We think that the new trend is already set. And is already there. As I said, from our perspective, we are seeing, unfortunately for the US coal mining companies, but we are seeing a fall in production and a fall in exports. So to some extent, you could say that, or argue that the effort that could take place in the US could benefit to the rest of or some part of the international coal market.
Okay, Sharath Rao, let's come to you. I mean, what do you think of what the US is proposing and its potential impact?
Sure. So what I think is, personally, I would like to say that US could have done a little bit more compared to what they've actually said. And let me put it another way, the current targets, what they have mentioned, what you just quoted, this comes to approximately 10% reduction in overall emissions of 2030 of 2005 level emissions by 2030. Now, and I kind of totally agree with the Mayor Bloomberg saying that Obama could have done a little bit more. But on another side, I think it's a step in the right direction because the previous governments didn't move anywhere. They could have taken this initiative too, but they didn't. But let me add, and as my colleague had just pointed out, and it was the first instance wherein last year or early this year, wherein gas, the amount of power generation from gas exceeded amount of generation from coal. And this can be clearly seen because of the prices of the gas in the market. And one can clearly see that the shale gas has kind of revolutionized the whole transitioning fuel or the clean fuel. And yeah, that's it.
I mean, there's a number of elements involved in this. Not only is the cuts that Obama proposing sort of consistent with the cuts that have already been underway for the past few years, but let me just point out another couple of facts that the critics are suggesting. Within the bill itself, the president's rule, it says, will save just 6% from carbon emissions by 2030. James Hansen, one of the senior climate scientists in the world who's been warning about this for a very long time, calls the whole thing something of a farce. He says the plan is practically worthless. So at the end of the day, as a climate scientist, do you consider that as we progress to the Paris conference, which is going to be a fairly momentous moment for the climate change debate, do you think Obama's plan is going to be taken particularly seriously by the scientific community?
Okay, I would rather say that prior to this, US has never made any kind of commitments. So to answer your question I mean, it's not a yes or a no question, but I would rather say that's the first time they have made some kind of a pledge. And going by that direction, that's at least the first step that has been taken. So it will at least give a boost for the whole climate, because the biggest emitter or the second biggest emitter is at least coming to the table, and with some firm commitments and with some firm numbers. But that being said, the EPAs has got to do a lot of, there'll be a lot of wrangling within the US, a lot of state governments, a lot of coal lobby will put in, and there'll be a lot of lawsuits, and each lawsuit has to be played accordingly. So I'm not sure how much time will it take to actual implementation of these targets will start happening. Although the legislation the legislation says that by 2018 things should start moving on ground. So.
Part of, Sharath Rao, part of the main proposal for this bill, part of the main theory behind this bill is it will encourage investment into alternative sources. Do you think that is going to happen, given what you've seen?
Oh, sure. Yes, and I would rather say that, I would put it in this way. We have, I mean, from C-STEP's perspective, we have run scenarios not for the global perspective, from India perspective. But I would also like to say that I have personally, we've looked at the BP's scenarios, and although they have not taken into consideration the current legislation put forth by Obama, but we have seen that most of these trends, I'll come back straight to the question, what you just raised, but most of these scenarios, they point towards like that by 2025 and 2026, most of the traditional fuels would going to peak. Pan the globe, barring like Asian and Southeast Asian economies. Even China, the biggest consumer of coal, would kind of peak in 2025. So there's a natural movement towards renewables that's already happening. So to answer your question, yes, I mean, this would certainly provide an impetus and a boost in that direction, that yes, all the scenarios, everything is going in that direction. So let's move in that direction. And it provides the impetus, not just, it just provides impetus to the private players. Yes, the government is very serious about it.
Guillaume, what about on a global level? I mean, we've talked about the rise of gas as power production mechanism. We've talked about the rise of sustainables, but coal is still a major global commodity that's used in power production. Do you see that balance changing? How does the coal industry look at the big picture?
Sure. So let me...
Yeah, I mean, definitely. We think that for many countries, the coal consumptions has peaked, or the growth in coal consumption, more generally in total electricity generation, will also decrease significantly. Just back very quickly to the US, the move or the migration away from coal is largely fueled, if I might say, by the existence of shale gas. So the US have been blessed by the fact that they had oil reserves and then coal reserves, and now shale gas reserves that are fueling, in a way, the industrial demand and
right,
domestic
but we're not seeing that in China or India, are we?
Other countries. No, exactly, because in many other countries, well, first of all, shale gas reserves are not as available as in the US, and cannot be exploited as easily as in the US. So in many other countries, and for instance, that's what we saw in Germany in 2010 with the Energiewende, we saw a move to a very prompt move towards renewables. That's what we are starting to see in China as well. So in many countries, we start to see an interesting combination between coal and renewables. Renewables meaning wind and solar. And in a surprising twist, if we look at Germany, gas generation has in fact been the victim, in a way, of this surge in renewable capacity, because it looks like the combination of extremes, coal and renewables, might achieve the best results in terms of decreasing the CO2 emission, but also providing the cheapest electricity, the cheapest cost and price for electricity being delivered, in particular in emerging countries.
All right. Sharath Rao, quickly before we let you go, what about the political direction that you see as we head towards Paris? Obama's presented his plan. Hillary Clinton's plan is slightly, we're told, slightly sharper than Obama's, but still nothing particularly spectacular. Do you see the political impetus from the US and from elsewhere as we go to Paris ramping up towards a considerable deal in Paris, or not?
So I will actually, what I would rather say that, I'll actually step back a little bit over here. So that, we have seen quite a lot of accords till date, like, starting off with Copenhagen summit, and then we had Mexico event prior to that. Nothing substantial came out of the climate agreements post-Kyoto. After post-Kyoto, which was when it ended in 2012, nothing much came out of it. And as such, we saw pretty much the carbon market especially took a big hit because of that. But that being said, the investments in the renewable sector has been significant. I mean, I don't have exact percentage over here, but the numbers, if you can clearly see that in either the Bloomington New Energy Finance from their analysis, or you can see pretty much with respect to Asian Development Bank's investments in the renewable energy sector. So what I believe personally is from this climate negotiations is that there is going to be a kind of a commitment which will certainly be made, a kind of an accord there's a possibility of an accord that might come up, and people might be agreeing to certain substantial emitting countries, though might not come to a binding GHG emission targets, but they might still come to a general conclusion that yes, we will peak by a certain year, and they'll agree upon that.
All right.
So, And there might be a possibility that with that there might be a firm pledge for X amount of dollars that might come to the table.
All right. Charithra, I appreciate you being on the program today. Thanks for joining us. We'll take a short break. When we come back, Guillaume will stay with us and we'll consider the future of coal a little bit more deeply. It's a relatively ubiquitous and cheap source of energy. Will it continue to be used around the world? Stay with us. And welcome back. Australia's federal court recently overturned an approval for India's and Adani coal mine in Queensland because a minister failed to consider its impact on 2 endangered species. They said it could damage efforts to contain global warming as well. Now the attention will be on 2 other mines proposed for agricultural land in the state of New South Wales, one of those being the $1.2 billion Chinese state-owned Shenhua Watermark coal mine. Now while that mine will not be built directly on farmland, there are still outstanding concerns about groundwater in the region. Now, with the price of export coal dropping, what are the prospects of either project succeeding, and what will be the impact of policy on the global warming conversation? Joining me from Sydney, Dr. Nicola Chasule, a climate and energy campaigner for Greenpeace Australia Pacific. Still with us, Guillaume Perret, founder and director of Perret Associates in London. Thank you for being with us, gentlemen. Nicola, let me begin with you, if I might. Let's just consider the big picture here. We've been talking in the first half about President Obama's proposals for climate change and the cutting of carbon emissions. What do you make of those? And are they big enough? And will they have an impact on the global conversation?
The proposals on the table by President Obama are a step in the right direction, but unfortunately they're not far enough. We need to be much more ambitious in dealing with the threat posed by global warming if we're to keep it to safe levels. And you know, the recent announcement relating to pollution from coal-fired power plants, for example, again, a step in the right direction, but already the reductions that are talked about, the 15% has been made. So I think while there are movements that are positive, the threat that we face is much greater than that.
We spoke there a moment ago about a couple of these projects in Australia. For Australia, the whole commodity sector, the whole mining sector is a major plank of their economy. And Tony Abbott has already said that as far as he's concerned, jobs in the economy are much more important than the climate change conversation. Tell us how you interpret the impact of all of this on the Australian conversation and what they might be thinking when we get to the Paris conference in December.
Well, today, the Australian government announced its post-2020 emissions targets, and they were some of the lowest in the whole developed world. So again, we need to be far more ambitious on that front. But in terms of the broader conversation, the coal mines that you referred to in your introduction, I mean, these are going to be incredibly damaging to the environment in Australia. The Great Barrier Reef, a World Heritage Site, is currently under threat from the Carmichael coal mine, both because of climate change and the direct impacts. So in Australia, very much the government is out of step with public opinion that wants the Great Barrier Reef protected, that wants the environment taken care of, and that understands, it should be said, that this dichotomy between jobs and between sustainability is a false one. The technologies of the future, the solar and wind sources that we're going to get our energy from as we move away from coal will provide many more jobs than the ones that we're talking about at the moment. So I think I reject the claim that is made by Prime Minister Abbott in that regard.
He's not the only one, is he? Guillaume, you mentioned in the first half that the coal industry overall is beginning and is on a long-term decline path. That dichotomy between jobs and the climate in the coal industry is something that everybody should be planning for already, isn't it? Are they not doing so?
Yeah, they are. I mean, back to the US, you know, I think the sector that has been struggling most at the moment is the mining sector in the coal industry. But I would say not only if you look at the iron ore sector, if you look at the commodity sector on the supply side in general, many markets have been subject to oversupply because of the lack of demand we have seen, or growth in demand we have seen in particular in emerging countries in recent years and months. And on the other hand, the very ambitious projects on the supply side worldwide, in particular in Australia, Back to the Galilee example in Northeast Australia you were talking about, or you were mentioning. In our long-term assumptions already 2 years ago, we have always discounted the feasibility and the viability of this project. We tend to look at it more from a market perspective rather than a political perspective. Because from looking at the fundamental of the market, the demand is not there. So we don't think that the international coal market is ready to absorb another 100 or 200 million tons of Australian or world production in the coming years.
Yeah, but
we think that at best the coal consumption worldwide could be flat. With some replacement of demand from old economies or economies that have been growing very quickly over the last 5 years to new emerging markets.
Sure, but I'm just wondering what the industry itself is talking about. I mean, I remember over the course of the past 6 or 7 or 8 years when the whole oil question has been coming up, all the oil companies were unanimously saying there is no oil problem because we've got all these new technologies coming online. We've got this fracking coming online. We've got the coal sands, the tar sands coming online. They weren't worried about their own industry because they had technology to deal with the potential for decline. I'm wondering if there's a similar conversation happening in the coal industry. Are they talking about new technologies that will give new life to their business, or are they really planning for decline?
No, I think there is more. There are new technologies coming in place. Personally, we are not a big believer in the carbon capture and storage, the storage of CO2 on the ground. But I think that the recycling of CO2 and production of carbon itself and oxygen could be a very interesting one. More broadly, if we were just replacing all the old inefficient coal-fired power plants worldwide by new power plants with an efficiency of 40–45%. Then even the most ambitious targets in terms of CO2 emissions would be reached. So I think that the industry and more generally the energy market look at coal as still the backbone in electricity generation in many countries, in particular emerging countries. In a way, as I mentioned for Germany, the interesting twist is that the development of renewable solar and wind generation can actually help, in some countries at least, coal demand to remain relatively robust.
Right. Very quickly, Nicola, the fact remains that in some developing countries, China and India notably, coal is still the backbone of their power generation. Are you seeing enough political momentum in this conversation to take us to a reasonable solution in Paris?
I think the political momentum is there and it's building. Just on China, China's consumption of coal dropped by around 4% over the last year, while its economic growth continued at around 7%. So when we see this decoupling of fossil fuel and coal-fired power from economic growth, from GDP growth, that provides the opportunity because it means that the standard of living that countries enjoy can be maintained and can be increased while still moving away from polluting fossil fuels. So the momentum is there, but more work needs to be done to make sure that we get an agreement at Paris that is truly up to the challenge that we face on climate change.
Nicolas Chasselet, Guillaume Perret, thank you both for being on the program tonight.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for our program today. On Wednesday on Between the Lines, the ASEAN ministers who met last week signaled a collective concern about the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. But they say they're not sure how to address the situation. Is China dividing ASEAN opinion? We'll discuss that on Wednesday on Between the Lines. But tonight, I'll leave you with a reminder of our show's online address, channelnewsasia.com/video. Goodbye for now.